Hello, this is Luke Turner, and I'm back with, I believe, episode 9 of Building a Web App from Scratch. Since this is episode 9, that means it's been, 16 hours approximately of work on this web app so far. And at this point, I would say that we're reaching having the core functionality done. But we still have a lot of work to go. Let's take a look at our notes file here. Last time we implemented Unix, which was a big change, and the settings page. But we didn't implement the ability to export and delete your data. That part I think I'm going to save for another time though, because today what I'd kind of like to focus on is some design and UI patterns. Before we get too deep into talking about that though, let's actually start up the app. I'm going to run the database, run the client-side code bundler, open up a new tab, run the server. And then we can open that in our web browser. Go to today. Okay, so here we are. We've got functionality for logging and tracking exercises. There's units associated with the different exercise parameters. We have the ability to manage these exercises. And if you go to the edit page for a particular exercise, you can see the historical trends for that exercise in both graph and table form. Oh, I'm noticing this just now is a bit of a bug I'll have to fix. Let me add a note about that so I don't forget. Okie doke. But kind of the problem with the app right now, the biggest problem in sight, is the UI is not polished. And beyond not polished, it's not unified. You could really just barely call it functional. It does work, but that's about all you can say for it. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about how I think about UI stuff, because everybody has their own approach to this, I think. It seems like there are as many different approaches to design and UI as there are people out there. When I'm at work, usually there's kind of a pattern where UIs are designed by, a dedicated designer. And there's something where we have, either product or engineering coming up with a list of requirements or goals, and then collaborating with the UI designer to construct a UI that meets those requirements. And, maybe a low fidelity or a high fidelity mock-up. And then that mock-up is sent to engineering to implement. And depending on where you are, some companies expect maybe a pixel perfect implementation of that mock-up, especially if it's a high fidelity one. Or it might be more of a recommendation or an example for engineering to follow, but there's not an expectation of that pixel perfect duplication. A lot of that goes into how much effort was actually put into that mock-up in the first place as well. But when I'm working on apps by myself, I don't consider myself to be an amazing UI designer. Not because I'm an engineer, because there are some engineers that are amazing UI designers. It's not like they're incompatible. But just for me personally, I don't get very excited about the idea of building a pixel perfect or idealized UI. But what I do like is a UI where it's highly usable. And that's kind of my goal when I'm building a UI, is to focus on the user experience of the application as opposed to thinking too much about how it looks. A lot of my apps have, a pretty black and white theme, for example, because that's easier to implement. But I try and streamline the interface as much as possible to allow common actions to be easy, while also making uncommon actions possible and intuitive to find. And that's kind of the approach I'll be taking with this app as well. Part of that is understanding the proper UI primitives to represent the data that you're actually trying to build a UI for, right? When you're building a web app, the UI is fundamentally the way that the users are interacting with your application. But the data in the database and the structure of that data fundamentally represents the goals and the needs of what the application is trying to support. Like in this case, we have this ability to log sets for a given day, sets of an exercise. And that is something where that's a core functionality or goal of the application. And the UI should be built around making that as easy as possible. And also when a user is interacting with the app, it's not uncommon for them to mostly interact with just a couple pages. Like in this particular case, we have this today page, which, you can go to the past, so it's not always just today, but the principle of the page is the same. And this is where users are going to be logging their exercise. They'll be interacting with this page maybe 3 to 5 days a week, multiple times per day. Probably an environment where they're going to want it to be rapidly functional. Like they just did some exercises, they want to log that. They don't really want to have to think about that too hard or use a bunch of clicks. It should be fast and easy. In contrast, something like the Manage Exercises page is something that users might not really need to go to very often at all. Maybe just once or twice a month. And even that is probably mostly just in order to see these graphs. They're not really going to be changing the settings on these exercises all that much or creating new exercises all that frequently. And so this page, it's more important for it to be usable, but not necessarily in a minimal number of clicks. At least that's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. We'll see as we go. The settings page is similar where, the user might only go in here once to set their settings and then never come back. And so we want to make it clear how the settings are set. One of the problems with this page right now is it doesn't have help text. And there's other problems as well. But ultimately, the settings page doesn't need to be very fancy. And kind of for that reason, I'm going to focus my exercises on doing the today page first. So for the today page, what is the data model that we're talking about here? We have a list of sets, right? Multiple sets per day. Those sets have an order associated with them. That order is actually a property of the schema. If we look at the sets table here, there's an order property that describes what order they should be in. So our page is going to need to respect that. And it has, this set of parameters, some number of parameters. As we can see here, there's like weight, assisted weight, distance, duration, intensity. And some of those might be used for a given exercise and some of them might not be. So what we have here, in my mind, what that is sounding like, we have a list of entities. And for each of those entities, there's potentially multiple parameters that need to be set for those entities. So we have like a two-dimensional layout. And this feels like a table. Now, I don't necessarily think we want to use an actual HTML table here. In fact, I wouldn't even use like a CSS grid table necessarily, but something where it has that structure of one row per set. And within that row, there's multiple columns, quote unquote, for each parameter for that set. And in the mobile view, those columns can collapse. This is kind of how I'm thinking about it. And then logging an exercise is an interesting case as well, because we're going to be trying to basically add a row to that table. A lot of times when you do that, kind of the way that I like to think about it is, yes, you could have a separate UI for that. Maybe you have an add button that you click and it pops up a modal dialog. Maybe there's a separate section on the bottom of the page, just like this. But kind of a nice way to do it is to actually create a row in the table that's like the yet to be created set. And the user can just fill out that row as though the set already exists, and it will, be created for them. And then another row will automatically appear underneath for them to create their next set. So we'll see how that goes. But that's kind of how I'm thinking about it right now. Okay, so with that out of the way, we can actually start thinking about how we're going to want to implement this. Let me open up the Bulma docs once again, just get this ready to go, because we're going to be using Bulma quite a bit. And the other thing we're going to need to be thinking about is, as we're building this new UI, it's going to require probably some changes on the back end as well. In particular, like the dynamism of this UI is not high, right? We have a read-only set, and then you click an edit button, you change all of your parameters at once, and you submit that, very much like a form. But that's 3 clicks to change one value. Whereas if these things were editable in their default state, the user could just change a value, and it would automatically update that on the back end. That's basically 1 click. And so, we're going to want to keep things like that in mind as well, not be limited by the current framework of how our stuff works. Okay, anyway, let's actually look at the code a bit here for this today page. And I guess one other thing I'll add, like, why am I doing this now? Why didn't I do the UI design at the beginning? And part of that is because I find that although it's possible to build a UI with mocked up data, it also tends to lead you to overlook things a little bit more. If you haven't designed the application considerably upfront, then that mocked up data might ultimately not reflect what your actual data is going to be. An example is like when I very first started this app, I had the idea of reps as something that was its own unique value. And if I had designed the UI at that point, I might have had some unique UI elements around reps. But now I've shifted the data model of the application so that reps are just another parameter alongside these others. And because of that, that's going to impact the way I'm going to design the UI as well. And because I didn't really think about these design decisions up front, which is pretty common for me when I'm working on a side project type of application, I like to experiment as I go. Doing too much polish of the UI upfront can result in some wasted effort. I like to kind of build out the core functionality of the application before actually diving into that UI part. Okay, so first of all, we talked about how we want these sets to be in a table form. Currently, they're in like this card form. Like if I create 2 here, we can kind of see what that's going to look like. We've got these 2 separate cards. This uses up a lot of screen real estate. I want to collapse this down into a form where we just have, the exercise name as like a column, and then the different parameters kind of proceeding after that. If we look at the Bulma docs, I wonder if there's a component that's going to help us with this. So one option would be something like a smart grid. I don't really know if that's necessary though. Intuitively speaking, the thing that makes the most sense to me is to start out with some simple flex box stuff. So let's think about these sets as a set of divs. And each of those divs is going to be a flex row. And we're going to do that by applying some of these classes to it. So we would do like div is flex row, right? Is flex direction row. And the advantage of using flex here is that when we resize the page down for our mobile development, you know, the different parameters are also going to be resized down appropriately. And we can, you know, set is flex wrap just to explicitly state that that should be the case. And we can worry about justifying and aligning a little bit once we actually get to that point. So then for each of these elements, we're going to have the set exercise name. And I'm just going to make this a div. And we don't really want the set ID in here. That's something that I added for debugging. But in the long-term UI, like the user doesn't really need to know the ID of the set. And then I'm going to skip over the editing part for a moment. And we're going to do something for each parameter once again. And in this case, for each parameter, we're just going to do a div. And the flexbox is going to deal with aligning these divs for us, you know, in a row, as opposed to normally divs are block elements which are aligned in columns, so to speak. I'm probably misusing the terminology there, but so let's see. There's can just be div, div, div. And within each of those divs, there's kind of like two things. There's the name and there's the value. And then arguably there's the unit. So maybe there's actually three things in here. And I'm kind of going to separate those out. So let's say if there's a parameter value, then we're going to do a div with the parameter name. Actually, let's just do a whole div here. And then we're going to do, say, a span with the parameter name. And kind of the idea here is from the parent flexbox perspective, this whole div should be treated as a unit. So we don't want it to wrap just the name, but not the value to the next line or vice versa or whatever. They should all be wrapped as a chunk. And then we're going to have a span for the parameter value. And we're doing these separately because it's just going to help us style them later. And let's do it like this, because the way that we're actually rendering that parameter value is different depending on the type of value it is. And then we're going to have another span for the unit. And this would be like minutes for this, for duration. And for this other thing, it would be unit. And I'm just going to, let's just comment out this whole card business here. Or actually, let's leave that in with another for loop. So we can kind of see them both side by side here. Let's take a look at what we've got now. Okay, so it's not pretty, but we can see that it's doing kind of what we expect here. We've got the dumbbell curl, and then for each parameter with a value, we've got like the, you know, the parameter name, and then like the number, and then the unit. And so one of the things we'll probably want to add here is like a certain level of padding or margin to these, which we can use some spacing classes for. So let's do probably margin right is fine. We could do like margin right 1, see what that looks like. That's basically, it looks like more or less one space worth of margin. We probably want that actually for these. So let's start down here. Margin right one, margin right one, margin right one. Like so. And we could do margin right 2 here, maybe. I'm thinking, oh, we can see the values here. So 1, 0.25, 2, 0.5. Let's actually do margin right 4. We want more space between the quote unquote columns than we do between the actual values in the columns. The white space will kind of allow the user to tell what parts of the UI are more related to each other, if that makes sense. Hope it makes sense. So now we can see like there's dumbbell curl, and then these are the 4 parameters for it. There's spacing between the elements in things, and then there's also more spacing between them. Okay. So one other thing though is like for each of these values, I actually want these values to be editable. And I'm going to start with that in the UI right away because it could potentially have some impact on how we do things here. So an example of what I mean by that is like this 1, 2, 3 should be something the user can directly click and edit. Sometimes there's a fancy thing people do with JavaScript where you have like text and then the user clicks the text and, you know, there's an on-click handler there where it replaces the text with an input element automatically. And we could do that if we want to be fancy, but for starters, I'm actually just going to make it a plain old input to begin with. So let's actually copy some of these editing things in here and start putting them in. So like here we would have another else if parameter.dataType equals intensity. So if it's intensity, this is kind of a special case where we have this select. And I think something like that, let's just start with that one here. Yeah, it kind of works. It selects the default value. If I edit one of these, set it to medium, submit, you know, it updates this as well. So it is actually using the value from the saved set. And then in theory, the user could change this and that would do something to actually reflect that change on the back end as well. Okay. We're going to do the same thing for all of the others now as well. So for duration, and I'm kind of copying these from down here in this edit panel because we already sort of figured this out before. For duration, we have a parameter, id parameter.id, name parameter.id, value, param value.minutes. Yeah, so if we do something like that, it's like, oh, that shouldn't have an equals. And in fact, it needs to be indented like that. So now our duration is like so. And we can do the same thing for weight and distance, for which we can kind of copy this here. And basically we're replacing this, but I kind of want to keep that there just for reference for a moment. This already has the same convert unit logic as we have up here, right? Right. Okay, so we can get rid of that. So now the weight and distance should, or weight and assisted weight should be using these drop downs as well. And what am I forgetting? Reps, right? So reps is kind of this last one here, where it's just a plain number and it doesn't have any associated unit with it. And here, you know, we could think about maybe whether or not these actually need to be in a span, or we could just apply the type, like the margin class, to the actual input. Let's try that for now. And like here as well, we could just do input MR1. Here as well, we could just do input MR4. And we need to add the same thing to this select as well, MR4. And then that should be fine. Okay. And let's save that and just take a look. Yep, looks the same. So the unit, this is not editable. And really, it almost feels like we don't really need padding here. Let's see what this looks like without padding for these. It kind of puts the unit right next to the number, so it feels like those are even more closely related. And of course, all of these inputs, they're pretty wide. I don't know if there's a width thing in Bulma or not. Yeah, not really sure. Either way, what we're actually probably going to want to start doing is incorporating some of our own CSS, which is, I've kind of avoided doing that so far, but it's not something we can stay away from forever. So let's actually add a CSS file that we're creating and managing ourselves. We can just call it main.css. And we can use that to style our stuff. In order for that to work, we're going to need to import it as well in here. We're importing it after the Bulma one. I don't know if that really matters, but it might matter. And let's just make sure that that is working. If we look at the network tab here and refresh the page, we should see that main.css being a 200. The response is empty because we haven't put anything in there yet. So what do we want to put in there? Well, first, let's do something like, don't really know exactly what we'll call these classes. So I'm just going to start with some words here. We're going to want to make these inputs smaller. And, we could set like a max width or a min width, but really I think fixing the width to a certain value is probably what makes the most sense here. We kind of understand approximately how many characters or digits the user is going to be putting into these. Like it's unlikely that they're going to be doing more than 4 digits and then the 1 after the 0. So that's like a 5-digit thing. I don't really know exactly how big that is, so we'll kind of experiment here. If we say 5 rem, and then we actually have to apply the class, of course. Let's actually go with 5em here instead. And then, so this is today input. We can just put that on these inputs here. And see what that looks like. So now, for instance, if I do, if I'm a real strong man, maybe I'm doing something with 4 digits. But I'm probably never going to be doing anything with 5 digits, which is good because the 5 digits starts to get cut off here. So in a way, this is sort of the perfect size for these inputs. And, really these numbers, these ups and downs, because it's incrementing and decrementing by 0.1, they're kind of annoying. And I wouldn't really expect a user to be using those much. I wonder if there's a way to remove that. I'm sure there is. I just don't know what it is. I don't think it would be a property on the element, an attribute on the element, more than a CSS style of some kind. Let's see, input number, remove arrows. Let's see what Stack Overflow has to say about that. I mean, kind of some annoying stuff here because it's browser dependent. Really not a fan of that, but let's just try it for now. And I'm actually not going to apply this to like all inputs, but specifically to just inputs with this class. And this is telling me there's actually a standard input for that, which I like to see. So now we don't have those up and down arrows here. And that means we can actually shorten this even more because, you know, we have that extra space there. So what if we did this as 4? Just curious how that looks. Right, so if we have 4 digits in there, this is looking pretty good. And, you know, we're going to want to style these inputs a little bit better in the future as well, but this is fine for now. One other thing, so we're going to want to put some spacing between each of these rows because, again, the closer things are together visually from the user's perspective, the more they seem to be coupled together in the mental model of the application as well. And so we need to put a little bit of space between each of these rows so that there's, you know, the user can see that they're separate, if that makes sense. So we could do like MB4. And let's see kind of what that does. Seems okay. We might even want to make that a little bit more. MB6. That seems like a bit of a lot. MB5. Sure, that's fine for now. Okay, and so let's see what else. There's obviously a lot of things that we kind of want to do here to make, you know, the rest of the page work better as well. But I kind of want to implement the actual functionality of these inputs and selects and things now as well. So what that means is that when the user is changing one of these values, it needs to do something. And so far we've been relying on these HTML forms where there's like a submit button that the user pushes and that does like a post and actually redirects the whole page. With these, we're probably going to want to use more JavaScript. So let's bring up our DataStar docs here as well. DataStar is kind of the library that I've been using for JavaScript interactivity. It's very lightweight. If we look over here, I think it talks about that a little bit. You know, it's small, and it kind of has functionality oriented around signals and just making event handling a little easier and adding reactivity in a simple way without needing to do a lot of tracking of those signals yourself. They're automatically updated when the signals that are referenced within the signals are changed. You know, a reactive data flow model. In this particular case, we don't really need the reactive data flow though. We're actually going to use something more of the data on function here. So let's start with the select. Why not? So we have like a data on change function here. And what is this going to do? Well, it's going to need to make an HTTP request of some kind. And I don't think we'll probably want to have one of these modifiers on there as well, but we can worry about that at a later date. Replaces the URL. We don't really want that. Data indicator. So this is using like server SSE. I think that's server sent events. I don't really know how this works. Let's see what this has to say. Backend SDKs. Let's see what this has to. Yeah, server sent events. I don't really understand why we would even really need server sent events at all, is my feeling at the moment. Really, for this particular use case, we kind of just want to send off a request with post, and we don't really care about what is responded to that. So let's just try it. I haven't used this before. I'm curious to see how it works. So if we do post, and then this is going to be slash, let's look down here at the submit button. Is referencing the form here. So it's slash sets slash ID. Slash sets slash plus set dot ID. So let's just see if we just do that. Wait, what is even going on here? Yeah, okay, there we go. If we just do this, what does this look like? Let's look at the network tab here. So if I change this intensity to low, it's not doing anything. Let's inspect this. So it's at post. I don't know if the on change really works for selects. I think it should. Just let's try it on a different one, I guess. So let's do it on this here. So now we have, anything weight or distance should have that data on change. And if I set this to that, did it do anything? No. Oh, I do have an error here. Generating expression failed. Well, let's actually do something more like a fetch, where it's actually built into the browser instead of using the weird data star version. It's still complaining. Does it tell me which expression failed? Syntax error on this. Oh, okay. Well, one obvious thing, this needs to be in quotes. Maybe that's what it's trying to tell me. What we actually had wasn't valid JavaScript. Now if I do that, it's doing a get in this case because it's fetch. and I haven't put in that parameter. If I replace this with @post, do we get a post? Yeah. Okay. So, that's a thing. I was curious to see what the payload was. This is not what I was expecting at all. So the payload is all of the signals for that page. Now that's very interesting. What are the options we can pass here? Content type, include local. I didn't even know local signals was a thing. That's interesting as well. So kind of what this is showing me is, like, say we add a signal for this. Data bind underscore number. Or let's call it underscore plus parameter dot ID. Just see how this works. And then actually, let's do like set.id underscore parameter.id. I don't know. Doesn't really matter too much what this is for now. And let's see how this then works over here. So if I set this to 1, 2, 3. So now we have those signals where it's set ID and then underscore and then the signal ID. And I mean, that kind of works, but it's janky, right? I don't really like the fact that I have to parse that out of the signal there, the signal name. What I would really like is for the signal itself to actually be an object for each set, which is the current values of that set in the UI. And namespace using dot notation. Maybe that's what I want to do. Is that what I want to do? I'm kind of curious how this works now. So say I do set.id dot parameter.id. How does that look in my request here? Click. Okay, so now we have for each set ID, there's the different parameters. That actually looks pretty good. And, probably I should have like something like sets dot plus like that, so we can see those as their own thing. Yep. And I mean, so I'm trying to think of how we want to support this on the back end then. Because the route that we're using right now is /set/ID. And, ideally we could continue using this route. And that would be fine. But especially, my concern would be that if we start adding things like debouncing or batching these requests, which might be possible, we might need the UI to actually be updating multiple sets at once. If the user changes this weight and this weight, rapidly, and that only sends one request, then we might need a kind of a different format for the route. But I mean, assuming we do want to keep this format, it makes me wonder, content type. A value of form tells the action to look for the closest form. Maybe we actually want that. I feel like that's got a compelling thing because it works with our existing kind of form-based endpoints. So if we do like content, let's kind of put these in some of their own lines here. Whoops. Because this is sort of turning into a big mess of an element. Okay, so this would be like content type. And I guess I don't really need the quotes on that part. Content type is form. And so then we're going to need to put a form in each of these rows. Which I guess it doesn't really need anything special in there. Maybe I could just do form like that. I wonder if it would work to do this, form. Okay, and then let's do 1, 2, 3, click away. So now the payload here has got all of the signals within that form. Or I don't know if they're signals or not, but they're the values. And in fact, because it has a duration and intensity that we haven't bound to any signals, we can see that those aren't signals at all. So we don't need this data bind, actually. And if we do that again, we get form data, weight, assisted distance, duration, intensity. Okay, so that's something. Let's compare that to what we've got going on here. If we actually submit one of these, it's got the exercise, that's one difference, and the reps is another difference. The reps aren't listed here, or they weren't listed here for some reason, which I'll have to think about that as well. But for starters, let's just get this exercise ID in there. So for that, we kind of need a, well, you know, I was going to say we need a hidden parameter, but actually one of the things I was planning on doing is making the exercise thing here editable as well. So the user can switch this exercise by clicking on a dropdown. So let's actually just put that in there, and then that should kind of solve that problem for itself. Fingers crossed. Dunk, 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 like so. And then this would be, I'll just put that MR4 on the select once again and get rid of the div. And we don't really need that data bind for this one yet. And we might need to re-add that later, but for now, this seems good. And in this case, the value is the ID and the thing that's rendered is the name. So that should work for our form here. The problem is, I guess we need a selected thing here. Let's kind of just copy this and rework it. So this is selected when the set.exercise equals exercise.id, right? And I want to see what I had here before. Oh yeah, let's look at it this way because we still have that part down here. Yeah, set.exercise is an object. So this would actually be set.exercise.id equals exercise.id. And then if we refresh this, those should have dumbbell curl selected. And then if I do like 4 on that, oh yeah, I haven't added the signal on that thing. So if I do 4 on that, it's posting a request that looks like this, which is pretty much what we want. And now I'm curious why these requests are not working. Invalid input syntax for type integer, not a number. Oh, okay. So what? um, let's try this again here. If I refresh the page, that what is this trying to tell me? I don't really know. I wonder if it's somehow, if we messed up the data in our database at some point in our testing. I'm not sure. Let's take a look. I'm going to open Table Plus. Oh, we're already here. Sets. And let's sort by the date here. We only really care about the ones for today. There's 2 of them. So, I mean, reps is an empty string. Is that part of the problem here? I wish I could see a little bit more about where this error was coming from. And just to confirm, if I do this, all it takes is refreshing this page to make that happen, right? No, I just refreshed the page. Okay, so what if I change one of these values now? Okay, now we get that error. So it's something to do with that request that we're making, that post request to /set/id. So let us first, I kind of want to do this. And then this. Kind of the idea here is because we don't really have a stack trace or anything on this error, I'm trying to understand where it's actually happening. This would be parameters. And then this would be this. Okay, let's refresh, and then we can do that and see what we get here. So the request.body is empty. That's interesting. What's empty about it? So the content type is multi-part form data, which is unusual. So like if I do it this way instead and submit this, I believe my content type is, I want to see the, oh yeah, here. Content type is form URL encoded. So that's kind of the content type that we want, not multi-part. And because it's multi-part, presumably this URL encoded handler here is not actually parsing that request body. And if I actually look at that request body raw, oh yeah, okay, 1. So like if I look at this payload here, it's showing me the decoded version. If I look at the source, yeah, it's actually a very different format than the URL encoded. I don't know if there's a convenient way to change that or why exactly Datastar is using that format. Don't know. There should be a way to get Express to support that as well, though. Let's see if there's a built-in middleware for that. Probably not. So there's a JSON middleware and a URL encoded middleware. There's this body parser middleware, which might support the multipart. It does not. Okay. Maybe we want to use one of these. Parsing incoming HTML form data. Yeah. And connect. Is this like an Express? I don't know what connect middleware means. But maybe this is kind of what we want. Busboy. Yeah. Okay, let's just try this. So we're going to install Busboy. And this other thing, connect Busboy. Because this busboy function is not really a middleware in the usual sense. It's more of a stream-based parser. And then we're going to want to import that and use it as a middleware. Instead of, or in addition to, our URL encoded one. So let's just start with that, busboy. And then this, I wonder if it's going to, no, it doesn't really. Import busboy from connect busboy. Maybe I need to install types for that as well. Fun install dev types, oops, types busboy. Okay, so now that should, oh, and connect busboy, righto. Okay, so now that should be a thing. And that seems to be working-ish. So now if I refresh this page, oh, right, got to restart my server here. And maybe I'll make a commit for that. Install busboy and connect busboy. And the only change here is, yeah, installing those new things. Who knows what the binary lock file looks like? It's a mystery. Okay, so now if I change one of these, let's see if the body is parsing into something interesting here. No. Why not? I mean, so we're putting these on the authenticated router, but I think that should be okay because the router is still being added to the main thing, and the fact that it worked with the URL encoded business is a sign that it should be working with this as well. Maybe I need some kind of settings in here. Yeah, immediately start reading from the request stream and parsing. I mean, is this really? I'm feeling like this is maybe not what I want. It doesn't seem to know how Express works, but let's try this. Yeah, so now we've got the same thing here where it's just an empty body. So what does this actually do? It sets rec.busboy. And then you have to do like these weird on things. That seems like a pain. Let's try taking a look at one of these other ones, like the multi-party. I really want something that's like, that knows how Express works, if that makes sense. I don't really care about how fast they are. Adds a body object and a file or files object. So this particular one might be exactly what we want actually. And I don't really, I don't need that upload functionality. Okay, let's try this, multer instead. Fun install multer, right? I feel like I didn't type that right, but I guess I must have. Bun install types, save dev, types multer. And then let's try using that. And if this works, then we can just uninstall busboy because multer is going to have it as a dependency anyway. And then we don't need that. Okay, let's see what this does. Oh yeah, got to restart the thing. Okay, it's immediately unhappy. I'm probably misusing this API. Yeah, so it's almost like, so multer is actually returning a thing, and then this would be like .none. Fine. Fine. Refresh. 1, 2, 3. Oh yeah, that one doesn't work. Can't forget that. Okay, so this time it actually worked. Let's see what the payload here is. So our rec.body has got the parameters in it that we expect. The exercise is being loaded as we expect. These parameters are being populated, and then it's doing a redirect. Now, at this point, we don't really need this redirect to happen. Let's actually uncomment that, or comment that, I mean. But we might want it to happen. I'm going to leave it in for now. Kind of, here's my thinking. So when the user modifies the state in the UI of one of these inputs, this post request is sent to the backend in order to synchronize that state change with what's going on in the backend. That's great. Now, once that happens, by doing the reload, like the redirect here, we're actually synchronizing the front end with what's currently present in the back end as well. So like as a simple example, I mean, obviously this is just a temporary thing right now, but if I change this weight value here, it doesn't update it here, right? These are two places where the same value is being referenced, but because we're not using the data star signals to synchronize them, this other part of the page isn't actually updated until we actually refresh the page, and then it should be, in theory. I'm noticing it's not like it's actually, because it's the same page, I guess, it's not even actually refreshing the page at all. Though, which makes sense because we're redirecting on an AJAX request. This doesn't really, I don't know if that really works or how exactly that works. Like it's doing something here, but it's just a fetch redirect. It's not actually redirecting the document page being rendered. So let's get rid of it after all. And if we're getting rid of that, we can get rid of the returning. And we can get rid of that. And we can get rid of these console logs. Okay. So now, we've got these tables. And, looking at this, you might be thinking that this table, quote unquote table, which is actually just a flex row UI, is actually more confusing and harder to use maybe than these other UIs, partly because of the way that the spacing of the columns is not really aligned at all. And that's something that we might want to deal with. But ultimately, that's something that, we can deal with. And once we do deal with it, it's going to feel better. And let's see what happens as well. If we kind of like do this, we can see that the so this is interesting. So we can see that the wrapping is happening, but like for this assisted weight, like if I move this in a little bit more, it's wrapping the kilogram span, but not the other elements of it. And we don't actually want that. So we might need to adjust some of this a little bit more. Like this div here, let's do this. And this is no wrap. Let's see if what that does. I'm curious. So now it's still wrapping them. Oh, for some reason, those aren't even in the div. Okay, that makes sense. That explains that. So this all needs to be indented. And now those should be wrapped as like a unit. Yeah. The whole assisted weight row goes down. Similarly, I guess we could add that MR4 onto this div instead of needing to specify it on each of these things. And that makes our code a little bit more dry. Let's kind of unexpand ourselves here. Okay. Okay, so I mean, that's kind of fine. One of the things we're going to run into is concerns where this actual exercise name is changing though. So suppose I change this to this, ASDF. Actually, let's wire these all up with signals before I do that. So these all kind of need this data on change business here. And, I do have a separate JavaScript file here where I could put like a function that can be used to abstract some of this repeated logic, but this function call is simple enough that I think I'm just going to copy paste it. So another case where we want that is here. And again, I'm going to, put these on separate lines just to make it a little more readable. And we also need to do the data on change thing here. And I think that will work. And then we also need to do that on here. And that should be fine. So we should have that on every single, oh, I missed this one. We need it on every single input or select in this, you know, set of conditionals here in this row. Okay. Okay, so now for example, say I change this to ASDF. First of all, we got some kind of thing that didn't work. Don't know why. Let's put these back in. Okay, it did work. It just didn't. Oh, right, of course. So I need to actually send a response here because I removed the redirect line. So I need to do like res.send 200. Fine. And I will get rid of these again. Get rid of it. Okay, there we go. Refresh. So yeah, so now updating this, you know, it's sending that response. We're getting back the okay. But kind of what I wanted to illustrate here now is suppose I change this back to dumbbell curl. That works fine. It actually updates the exercise, but we're not seeing the parameters listed for dumbbell curl. So we need to kind of re-add that functionality where depending on the value of this select, we dynamically show or hide these parameter fields. And actually, I'm going to get rid of this if param value thing in here as well, because we're going to be handling that with JavaScript instead of handling it with the templating. Okay, so here we're kind of going to do something similar to what we have here, where we have like data bind on this exercise ID. And really, you know, this could be like set dot id dot exercise, right? And so that's going to create a signal called set.set.id.exercise, which is bound to the value of this select. Let's see if I refresh the page here. Does that work or do I get an error? No, it works. Kind of. The problem is that the data bind initial value is not right, which is the same kind of problem that I had somewhere else. So like I would have to do a data signals. And let's start putting all these into new sections here as well. Oops. Or new lines, I mean. So I think I need a default value for this signal here. So it would be like data signals set.id.exercise like this equals set.exercise.id. Maybe there's a better way to do this that will come to me like a flash in the future, but for now, let's see what this looks like. So we have data bind set.26.exercise. Well, that's kind of weird too. I don't know if that works. Hopefully it works. And I'm not seeing that actual data signal on there. But I think that happens with the data signals. It gets stripped out and that data star ID thing gets put on instead. Let's, just out of curiosity, let's just simplify this a bit and see how that works. Okay, so that works, but the problem is they're now all using the same signal, which is not what we want. And what that's kind of telling me is maybe this set.id thing being a number is kind of throwing it off. I'm curious what happens if I just do, if I get rid of that dot. Bit weird, but does that work? No, that does not work. What if I get rid of that dot as well? Does that work? Kind of works. Okay, so now we're running into another problem. The problem here is that this is trying to render this parameter value, but the parameter value isn't always present because we put that like if parameter value thing in there. And the idea is that the JavaScript should be hiding these if the parameter value is not present anyway. But kind of what this is telling me is that we sort of need the server to also have that check as well, I guess, which kind of makes sense, but it's also kind of annoying. But I'll just add it back in. Why not? For now. Refresh. So the problem with that though, and I mean, we can kind of see now that this signal thing is working. So it wasn't liking those dots. I guess this might be the issue there. Like if this, like here, these were namespaced with dots and that might work. But then here where we're using this object form, we might need to actually use a nested object type of formatting. But I'm not going to worry about that right now because what we have here works and we can improve it as we go. But the problem that we have now is this if parameter value business where all of these, you know, so like say we have this 3 here now. If I changed this, well, first of all, let's see. Let's actually put this data show business that we use from these other things into the right spots here. So like here we would have a data show on this div where it's like, hey, if there's the exercise, and we're going to also need a data computed. We're kind of copying the logic from down here. So the data computed is going to be I don't know if this is possible. It would be like set plus, yeah, I don't think that's going to work. Let's look at the data computed docs here real fast. Data computed. So the issue is that I want the data computed signal to be kind of dynamically calculated as well, not just the value dynamically calculated, but actually the key, the name of the signal by the server, something like that. And this would be, let's call this exercise ID actually. And then this would be $set, set.id, exercise ID. My goodness. What chaos are we creating for ourselves here? And then this is going to be end quote, end paren there. Those we don't want, right? Right. Let's just see that this syntax is actually like working. So now our data computed is set26 exercise. Looks like that should be okay. And then now down here, it would be like this value. And I think that is kind of a thing. I don't really know why. So like this is a form and then this is also, oh yeah, that makes sense. So this is a form, but it has no parameters. And then we get down here to the next form, which actually has some of these parameters defined. So let's see what happens if I switch this to a different one. Nothing. Am I getting a console error? Computed key required. If I set this to that, does that make that error go away? It does, but now we get that other error, which makes sense. So kind of the problem that I'm seeing is I don't know if this computed thing is going to work as well as we want it to. But we can also just put that in here instead, because it's only used in one place anyway. And get rid of that altogether. And the chaos grows. So now if we switch this to something else, what happens? Anything in particular? No. It should be deleting these or, you know, hiding these things. So let's add some data text. Things here. Like, let's just add it like this. Data text is this. And we can see like, what is that actually? So it is an object. And then if I switch this to something else, it becomes undefined. Okay, I mean, that's what I would expect. It's looking good, actually. Okay, so now that's true. If I switch it to something else, it becomes false. But then why aren't these actually hiding if that is false? Because we're using data show on this div. It has style display none on it, but that's getting overridden by the display flex. It's kind of odd because normally the styles actually on the element should be more important, but this display flex is actually adding this, you know, important modifier or whatever it is on here. So this is overriding the style on the element, which seems really kind of dumb that Bulma would do that. I mean, I'm sure they have their reasons, but usually you really shouldn't be using those uppercase important flags like at all. So, you know, we could do something else, but probably what I'm actually going to do is just replace this with my own flex declaration here. And I'm going to do that here. Flex, display flex, and we're not going to have the important flag on that. And now, you know, if I set this to dumbbell curl and switch it to something else, the fields are hidden. Okie doke. That's good. And let's get rid of this data text. So kind of the problem, though, that I've been sort of waiting to bring up, but I had to work through those issues first, is, you know, so if I switch this to something else, those are hidden. If I switch it back, they appear again. But if I switch this one up here to dumbbell curl, they don't appear. And the reason for that is because they're not actually being hidden by the JavaScript. They're hidden by this if param value flag, which is preventing them from being sent from the server at all. So they're, you know, these aren't hidden divs with display none. The divs don't exist in the document HTML at all. And so there's nothing that JavaScript can really do about that. So again, we actually need to get rid of this if param value flag, and we need to basically update these things to just handle cases where that param value is null. And like one thing you could do is set like a default here, but that's probably going to result in some weird outputs from these functions. So probably a better thing is if we could do like param value convert unit, otherwise 0 kind of thing. And just do that for everywhere that the param value is being referenced. Is probably a good idea. So also down here, param value.minutes, otherwise 0. And down here, we can just keep it because the param value itself is whatever. And I mean, maybe this should be null. I don't know how well that's going to work, but let's try it. Null on those. Or like an empty string maybe is what it should be instead. But let's just see how this works. Okay, so now we have these, like if I switch this to ASDF now, let's try and replicate the issue. Refresh the page, switch it to dumbbell curl, boom, they appear. And then if I set this to some number and click away, that should have made a post here. And if I refresh the page, it's still there. Great. Yeah, very great. Okay, so we're making some progress here. Basically, we simplified this whole box, except for the delete part, which we haven't implemented yet. And the need to do this editing and submitting is all just replaced with the user just changing a value. And that's all they need to do. And, you know, if they're like, oh, that wasn't a dumbbell curl, actually, it was a dumbbell press. I misclicked. It's like you can just switch it. And, you know, it updates the server as well. One thing that I'm noticing as well, though, that I kind of want to fix, minor point, but say I change this value, there was no actual request sent to the server until I click away from that input, until I blur or unfocus that input. Also, one of those things, I never really thought about this, but it actually makes, I was always like, why is it called blur? It's because it's become blurry. It's no longer focused, right? That's kind of a weird pun or something, but it actually makes sense. So I think there's another handler, another event that's not just like on change is only triggered when the element is blurred, but there's another thing that's triggered whenever the actual value is actually changed. And what is that? Let's go back to MDN and see if it has something to say about it. Change. No, I want to see the list of events that are supported by the input. Maybe I need to look at a more specific one. Like if I look at input type number, or no, let's look at the input HTML element DOM spec here. Maybe this will have what I'm looking for. Properties, 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 methods, events. Select, search, selection change, events. Yeah, so change. So unlike the input event, so this is actually the event that I want, I think. So let's switch these to that. So like here, instead of data on change, if we did data on input and do the same thing for all of these, except for the select, that one can stay on change. So now if I start typing in here, let's refresh the page. Each change that I make is actually going to send off an HTTP request. Okay. So that is fine, but it's kind of a lot of HTTP requests. So that's where, you know, we're going to want to use one of these modifiers. And I think we're going to want to use debounce. And let's see, is there an example of that? Yeah. What's the underscore window? Attaches the event listener to the window element? I don't know why that matters exactly. Don't really need to worry about that. And then leading versus trailing. I don't think we really need that leading, actually. But we might as well include it. It's just one more request. And we can kind of see, part of this is going to be experimenting with it as though we were a user and seeing what it's like to use some of these different things. And so let's just go ahead and change all these because I can't really keep track of which is which. Okay, and so why did we do that? So now let's go over here and see what happens to our HTTP requests. So we start changing this value. It's not sending a request, but when I stop doing it, it does send the request. And so, you know, all of those changes were basically collapsed into this one request. But I didn't have to click away either. So if I just like start typing in here, it's producing the things. And, you know, if I'm typing kind of slowly, like dunk, 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 taking more than 500 milliseconds each, then, you know, it's still sending some requests, but we're never going to send more than one request every 500 milliseconds, which should be fine, right? For the back end, that should be fine. It should prevent the possibility of having request A and request B both being processed at the same time and they get completed in the wrong order, which if you're sending requests really fast, there's that possibility. Like if the user types in 123 and each of those sends off an HTTP request, it's possible that the HTTP request receiving 123 completes, and then the HTTP request receiving 12 completes, and now the value in the database is actually 12 because that, for whatever reason, just ended up getting there later. There's no guarantee that the order that you send the requests in is the same as the order that they're received in by the server. But by adding 500 milliseconds of debouncing, there's still no guarantee, but it's a lot less likely that that's going to be a problem unless the requests are taking longer than 500 milliseconds, at which point, you maybe have some other problems going on as well. Very slow internet, which is sometimes a thing. But anyway, let's not worry about that. Okay, so now, the user's experience is a lot better, hopefully. They can just do this. They can set that to 12. They don't need to click anything. It's just click on the input, type your number, you're done. One-click editing. And this is kind of what I mean by building a UI where it's focused on the user experience. It's like it makes the user's tasks as simple as possible. Another way to think about it is sort of like a power user interface where it's maybe not, like this UI is maybe not holding somebody's hand really closely. It doesn't have a lot of like help text, a lot of explanation. It doesn't look like a normal form at all, but it minimizes the number of inputs that the user needs to make. Okay, so that's good. Now we're going to need to support creating things as well. And to do that, kind of what I talked about is we want another row in this table, which is like your new exercise row. And we sort of have two approaches for that. One, we could sort of copy paste all of this. Another would be to create like a dummy set in this each for loop. And combine the logic sort of together here. I wonder if it's possible to do like each set in sets. And now I'm kind of, let's see, let's open a REPL here. If I do like 1 plus 2, does that? No, that I didn't think so. So we'll use like concat. So like sets dot concat. And let's just put like an empty object in there and see if that works or if we get an error. Yeah, we're getting an error here. But the error is actually evaluating set.exercise.id. So this part's working. But then when we're going through this loop, it's kind of the rest of it that's not working, which makes sense. So let's see how much conditionality is involved here. So like I could call this, creating true, say. And so then we could say, here we're checking set.exercise.id. We could be like, not set.creating, and then that should fix this particular error case. And, up here, like the data signals, yeah, I mean, it's starting to be a little bit painful. I'm starting to think I might actually just want to make a whole separate thing. Like copy this whole row. And it's a bit annoying, but I'm just going to put this all down here as well. So And how did it just, we need to de-indent this all once, right? Yeah. Okay. So now we're getting this like extra row down here. And here, like, it's going to be doing a different post. Instead of posting to /sets or set ID, it's actually just going to be /sets, right? Because that's the route that we use when we're creating a new set. And then the data signal here is going to be like, it doesn't need set.id. It would be like new set. Let's just call it new. And then the value, the initial value here is just an empty string, I guess. And, you know, that's not going to work. Let's do single quotes there for that empty string. And then, you know, this is going to be, there's no real pre-selected value here at all. So we can get rid of that. And then for these other things, you know, so this signal is going to be this instead. And probably a lot of this other logic is going to be the same. There is no default value here, though, so we can get rid of that entirely, I believe. And the same thing here. Okay, so this is a little bit tricky. So let me kind of walk you through what I'm thinking about why this is tricky. We've set this up on the page so that when we change any of these fields, it modifies the set right then. But in order for that to work, we first need to have the set created. And so, like these things, we actually don't even really need for this. And let me illustrate that. Let's comment those out. Because the first change that you're ever going to do is picking the exercise. That's the, you know, if there's no exercise picked, there's no parameters that are displayed. So the user can first pick their exercise. And so say I'm like, oh, this is going to be a dumbbell curl. Now, if I actually refresh the page, well, that didn't seem to work. Let's try this again. Dumbbell curl. We're getting a pending. It's not... Right, so I need some of those hidden values in there as well. Let's just put those in here. I think that's like this. And those can go anywhere because they're hidden. Okay, so now let's refresh the page. Pick dumbbell curl. And that, you know, worked. And again, it returned to 302. We're going to fix that. Now if I refresh the page, that dumbbell curl is actually in this editing row up here. Does that make sense? It's no longer creating a new set. It's actually listed as one of the existing sets that we're editing. And so we could try and do something about that. But I'm actually thinking the best thing to do here maybe is to have this post see, so this is where we might in theory, be using those server sent events where it's like the server could send back an event that's like, okay, here's the new set. And then that could somehow be put into this list up here. Because like one of the problems is we don't know the ID for this set until the server creates it. We need to be parsing some stuff out of the response. But what I actually want to do is be reloading the page after this post request is completed. So I'm wondering if there's a way to do that. Over here. At post. How can I have something happen after the response is returned? Ideally without using an SSE event. I don't know. The problem is that I don't really know how these SSE events actually work. Like, implements the SDK spec, abstract server sent event generator class. Read signals request. So, I mean, it's possible that I could do this, actually, but I would need to install this thing. Great. And I mean, I'm not feeling very confident about how this works or how polished it is, or etc. Especially considering the examples aren't even, the link isn't even working. So I'm kind of wondering, like, I mean, what I really want is for this at post to just return a promise. And maybe it just does, and they don't talk about that. So let's see if that is the case. So now if I do this, yeah, okay, it did return a promise. So that's going to be a lot simpler for me. So instead of dealing with the server sent events business, which maybe eventually we'll want, but I just don't want it now, we can say, you know, send off this request and then reload the page. How do I reload a page? Window reload. Window.location.reload. So I could just do, well, I'll put in the window. Normally, like location is also in the global scope, so I could just do this as well, I think. But, well, let's just do that. Doesn't really matter. So now, if I select dumbbell curl, it sends that off. and then it's supposed to reload the page. Maybe I do need the window. I don't think so, though. Demo curl. Okay. I'm getting lost at how many I have here, so let's do that and then do that. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, that kind of works, right? When I select this, it doesn't just pop up a new thing here, but it's actually creating a new set and then reloading the page, causing that set to appear. A bit awkward. Ideally, we wouldn't have to reload the whole page, and that's kind of where these server sent event stuff would come in. You could use the server sent event to just like send one of these fragments of HTML, but that's very confusing. Or I should say that it would require a lot of changes to the way the app works, which I don't really want to deal with. Okay. Let's get rid of all of this now. We shouldn't really need any of that anymore. Just this table view. And there's, you know, still a lot of problems with this, I'm sure. But I think I'm going to make a commit. Oh yeah, that reminds me actually. Let's first fix this. So we're going to uninstall busboy and connect busboy and types busboy and types connect busboy, because we're using Multer instead. And Multer talks about using busboy under the hood, but doing this shouldn't cause a problem with that. Okay, so like replace busboy with Multer. And then I'm going to go ahead and I think I'll just commit all this as a chunk. Oh yeah, we can get rid of that import as well, because it doesn't even work anymore. And okay, just some meaningless problems, no actual TypeScript errors there. Okay, so let's take a look at the changes that we made here. So first of all, we, totally reworked this page. Pretty simple. We actually made it, a lot fewer lines of code, which is nice to see. And it's a lot simpler in structure as well. It doesn't have all that wasted white space. Now, to be clear, this is not the final form for what this page looks like. This is more like getting it closer to that tabular format. But there's some other issues that we're going to need to deal with, especially if we start having different types of exercises with different types of fields. It's not going to look so clean as it does now. Not to mention, these inputs need to be styled a little better. The spacing still feels a little wrong. Going to need to work on that. And stuff like that, the usual stuff. Another thing is like when we're going over here like this, so let's responsive view this. It looks a mess like this as well. So this is something we might actually want to fix with a kind of smart grid sort of thing. The more I think about it, the more an actual grid layout might feel good. But if we don't want to do a grid layout, one of the other things we could do is just defining a fixed width for all of these elements that we're flowing together. And, we could maybe just give that a shot here. So like these, I could have a thing where it's like set parameter. And this is a class we're defining ourselves. And, say I did like width, 10 rem, 10 em. That's interesting. 12 EM. Hmm. 8 EM. I'm kind of curious to see if we can. So what is going on with these? Geez, my HTML has turned into soup with all of these declarations from Datastar. So why are these not flowing anymore? Oh, right, because I kind of put that on the wrong thing. This set parameter should be on the, not on the whole row, but on the divs that make up the elements of that row. And let's put this data show in a new line like that as well. Okay. So we can see 8 is a little too small because they're overlapping and looking weird. Let's now try 12. And 12, I mean, is a little too big. I don't know. Let's just do 10, see what that looks like. Still kind of weird. I don't know why exactly, but what I kind of wanted to illustrate here, though, is like now, if this is in, yeah, it still doesn't look very good, though. Okay, well, let's not worry about that for now. In any case, kind of the point I was trying to make, and I don't know if I'm going to have time to really deal with this in this session, is we want these to be aligned in a way that's more visually pleasing to the eye when we start wrapping them. And I mean, really, that's where the smart grid business comes in. I wonder how easy it is to switch to that. I'm sort of curious. Like if I did this, it would be more like we have this fellow here is a grid instead of a flex. Let's stage these changes first so that I can make this change and then revert it if I don't like it. So form.grid. And then each of these divs is a cell. And this one is also a cell. What does that do? Okay, so I mean, the spacing's not right, but if we kind of do it like this, you can see now how like these are vertically aligned. And really we want the inputs to be aligned. So that's another thing that we're going to need to think about here. If we do a consistent spacing on these names, which since they're fixed values, it should be possible to just use the simple approach here of defining a width for these. Doesn't really seem to be helping, though. Display inline, right. But if I change it to a div, then it's going to put it in a new line. That's not what we want either. So really, I need to add the inline block display type to these so that we can define a width for them. And I got logged out randomly. I don't really know why that happens. Okay, so now, like if I go like this, we can see that now the inputs are aligned. You know, and this might be like text align right, if I can only type. And 5, you know, feels like a lot for all of them except for assisted. The assisted weight one takes up more, by far more than any of the others. And we might want to actually just fix that by changing that to not be assisted weight and just call it assisted. Okay, so now, you know, our columns are looking a little bit more normal, except for this duration minutes thing. And again, we could probably fix that just by, instead of calling it minutes, we can just call it something shorter. So now we have kind of more of a nice table looking view. And if we end up collapsing it, well, it's still doing something weird. But kind of what I wanted to illustrate here is like these, let's do it with the responsive view actually. So now it's like a little bit more easy to parse what's going on in this view, right? We have vertically aligned inputs, which make, you know, your brain is better able to understand what's going on than when they were kind of like all mismatched. At least my brain is. And, you know, also keep in mind that like these dumbbell curls with all of these different types of things, like that's not really common. That's not meant to be the normal use case. Like for instance, it doesn't really make sense to have reps and also distance, duration. I mean, maybe you could imagine like if you're doing interval sprints, maybe you do have like reps and also duration. It's like I did 10 sprints of 100 meters each, or, you know, 30 seconds each or whatever. But then, you know, you wouldn't really have both weight and assisted and intensity and everything all for that. Or if you do, that's kind of an unusual case. So we'll probably come up with some more realistic examples as we proceed. But for now, I'm just going to stick with this. It definitely feels better this way than having the Flexbox approach. And what do we call this? Update UI for today view. Not much else to say about it, really. Actually, maybe there is. Also, let's do a little bit more granular here. So I want to stage this multer stuff first. And these changes down here, we don't need to stage those. So this is going to be add multer middleware. And then one thing I'm reminded of as well for this post/sets, we talked about, you know, we don't need this redirect. We actually just want to do res.send 200. So now if I do this, let's open the network tab. If I do this, you know, it just does the thing. It doesn't have a 302 at all. Okie doke. And then I might do, I mean, I'm just going to add the rest of this all at once because it's all kind of coupled together. I was thinking of adding like this layout piece separately, but all of the content in this main.css file is only in use in the today page. So it doesn't really make sense to commit those classes without committing the places that those classes are used. So I'm just going to add it all at once, like update UI for today page to use a tabular style layout. Also make editing sets use Ajax instead of HTTP form submit. Okay. And as expected, we're a little bit over time at this point. I think we're pretty much good to go here. I'm going to go ahead and push these commits. And we'll continue working on the UI next time. Seems like we've figured a lot of stuff out with the data star library, so hopefully the next time we'll go a little bit faster. But as I mentioned, this is an important page as well. So we actually still have quite a bit more work to do on this actual page itself. And then we can update the other pages as well. All right. Well, thanks, y'all. See you next week.